Today, I'm joined by renowned narcolepsy expert, Dr. Thomas Scammell, to answer all your questions about the science of narcolepsy. Like, what causes narcolepsy? Is it genetic or are there environmental factors? What are orexins or hypocretin? And how do losing these neurotransmitters impair the wake-promoting systems? Dr. Thomas Scammell is a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and Boston Children's Hospital. He has published over 150 journal articles and chapters and lectured around the world on narcolepsy and the neurobiology of sleep and wakefulness. Welcome to Project Sleep's podcast. Project Sleep is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness and advocating for sleep health, sleep equity, and sleep disorders. I'm your host, Julie Flygar. We're so glad you're here as we work together towards making sleep cool. On this podcast, all guests express their own opinions. While medical diagnoses and treatment options are discussed for educational purposes, this information should not be taken as medical advice. Each person's experience is so unique, which is why it's so important to always consult your own medical team when making decisions about your own health. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss a Project Sleep podcast episode. And if you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a rating or review wherever you listen so that we can reach more listeners and raise more awareness. The Narcolepsy Nerd Alert series invites listeners to dive deeper into specific topics relevant to living with narcolepsy. For more on this topic, please check out our corresponding toolkit, available for free on our website to download, print, and share. The link to the toolkit and other Narcolepsy Nerd Alert topics is in the show notes, or you can go to project-sleep.com. Hello, everybody. We're so excited for today's topic, science of narcolepsy.
Just to kind of wind back, like way back, narcolepsy was first described by doctors. Of course, it's been around forever, but it was first described by doctors in the 1870s. And it was honestly completely profoundly mysterious until about 20 years ago, when it was found that narcolepsy type 1 is caused by a loss of the neurons in the brain that make orexin, which is also known as hypocretin. So on the clinical side, many of you might have heard about measuring hypocretin levels. I think the term orexin, which means the same thing, is going to become more and more prevalent as drugs that target this become used more frequently. This incredible discovery, and so from Emmanuel Mignot, where he's compiling the results of a few different studies. So in the control people, the levels of orexin ranged from a little more than 200 up to about 600, and the average level is around 320 or so. But in people who have narcolepsy with cataplexy, that's type 1 narcolepsy, 90% of the time, their levels are super low, meaning less than 110 picograms per mil on this scale. Very few people who have honest to goodness narcolepsy with cataplexy have normal-ish levels of orexin. And so that's huge. Type 1 narcolepsy is caused by orexin deficiency. People who have narcolepsy without cataplexy, that's type 2 narcolepsy, usually have normal levels. It's a similar appearing disease, but it has a different cause. And we actually still don't really understand what causes that. So this loss of orexin in spinal fluid is due to a loss of the orexin-producing neurons. In the International Classification of Sleep Disorders, which is what most doctors use to diagnose this, we now recognize these two types of narcolepsy. Narcolepsy type 1, which used to be known as narcolepsy with cataplexy, and sometimes this is abbreviated as NT1. And to make this diagnosis, you need to have chronic sleepiness, of course, and then you need to have cataplexy plus a multiple sleep latency test that's considered, quote, positive, meaning you fall asleep quickly, less than 8 minutes, and you have REM sleep in at least 2 of those naps that occur on the multiple sleep latency test. Another way to get that diagnosis is to have a spinal tap and to measure the cerebrospinal fluid orexin concentration. And if it's super low, then that also provides really strong evidence for narcolepsy type 1. Narcolepsy type 2 is diagnosed by the presence of chronic sleepiness plus this positive MSLT. And I have to say, in my clinic, a lot of the times when somebody sort of meets those criteria, I'm not 100% confident that that's really what they've got, whether it's narcolepsy type 2 or this kind of related disorder called idiopathic hypersomnia, because a lot of this hinges on the results of the multiple sleep latency test. And sometimes people have 2 naps with REM sleep, sometimes they have 1, and that can actually really impact whether you're diagnosed as idiopathic hypersomnia or narcolepsy type 2. I think many people who are listening in probably also recognize that in narcolepsy, there's more than just sleepiness and cataplexy. People can have hallucinations around the edge of sleep. These are called hypnagogic hallucinations. They can have sleep paralysis, where when you wake up, you can't move. And they can, of course, have fragmented sleep, which is lots of spontaneous awakenings across the night. And these are all generally more frequent and prevalent in type 1 narcolepsy, but they're still found in type 2. But they're also kind of found in the general population. So diagnostically, they're not super helpful for doctors. But of course, they're important symptoms that we sometimes need to target. Sometimes people with narcolepsy, particularly type 1, will go into REM sleep super fast at night. Normally, it takes 60 to 90 minutes to get into your first episode of rapid eye movement sleep. But especially in type 1 narcolepsy, people can get into REM sleep in less than 5 minutes. And if it happens in less than 15 minutes, that's actually included in the tally of those REM episodes that can help support the diagnosis.
Dr. Scammell was my doctor and diagnosed me with type 1 narcolepsy 14 years ago. And I remember you saying that I went into REM sleep so quickly in all 5 of my naps. It seems to be very defining, that test, the MSLT for type 1. Yeah. And I don't know if we want to talk about it now, but I mean, something that's hugely curiosity for me is this type 2 narcolepsy versus idiopathic hypersomnia diagnosis. And I imagine, like you said, like many people that are tuned in, they often sometimes even get their diagnosis changed if they go to a different doctor or have a second sleep study. And I was just kind of wondering, do you think this will evolve, the titles of these?
Well, I think we can do better. So I think in general, it's for a doctor who knows what they're doing, diagnosing narcolepsy type 1 is usually pretty straightforward. Cataplexy is very, very distinctive usually. And as you say, many times on the multiple sleep latency test, people have strikingly positive results. REM sleep, like you say, in many of the naps. And it actually would be, even though you only need REM sleep in 2 of the naps to meet criteria, most people with type 1 narcolepsy will have it in 3, 4, 5 of the naps like you did. And they have very short REM latencies. But type 2 is hard because I completely agree with you. The term that we use for this is test, retest, reproducibility, right? And so if you do the multiple sleep latency test today, and then you do it again in 6 months, you're going to get the same results. And little teeny variations in normal biology and environmental things can make a difference. Like maybe somebody just falls asleep a little shorter. Maybe the room's hot. Maybe there's noise in the hallway. Maybe they didn't sleep well the night before. There's all these things that can impact this. And so the truth is, several research groups have now found that in type 2 narcolepsy, the results of the multiple sleep latency test are kind of fickle. And so I think we trust it less than we used to. When these definitions were made about 10 years ago, people were like, oh, this is great. We've got these nice, tidy diagnoses. But now I think we sort of recognize it's like, that diagnosis of type 2 is something that should have a question mark after it much of the time. And unfortunately, we don't have a better way of diagnosing it yet. There's a lot of interest in this, of looking at other physiologic biomarkers. Okay, are there things in the brain waves or the sleep patterns or other things you can measure in the blood that may be helpful for teasing apart type 2 narcolepsy and idiopathic hypersomnia? And thus far, I would say there's not too much that's super distinctive. There is some aspects of nighttime sleep architecture, the different stages of sleep, that might be somewhat useful. Like idiopathic hypersomnia patients tend to have less fragmented sleep. They tend to have longer, more monotonous non-REM sleep, stage N2. But it's all kind of preliminary. And I don't think there's anything you can really bank on yet that's going to be diagnostically definitive. So on the plus side, we treat all these with the same medications. And one would hope that in general, with enough perseverance from the treating doctors, it should be possible to get the right medicines to the right people. But there are some insurers who say, well, we don't really have any approved medicines for idiopathic hypersomnia. And in that case, it would be a lot more convenient to have a narcolepsy diagnosis. "20 years ago, researchers discovered that narcolepsy is caused by a selective loss of the orexin or hypocretin producing neurons in the brain. Now, what caused that wasn't clear. It was known since the 1980s that narcolepsy is strongly linked to a particular genetic marker that goes by this awkward name of HLA DQB1 star 0602. It's a gene that shows up in lots of people with type 1 narcolepsy and many people with type 2. Specifically, over 90% of people with type 1 narcolepsy carry that gene. We call it 0602. And over 50% of people with type 2 carry that. The gene, however, is found in the general population, and depending on which country, 10 to 25% or so. And so just having the gene alone doesn't make you develop narcolepsy, but it does seem to be a fairly necessary prerequisite for developing it. Very few people who have type 1 narcolepsy lack 0602. So it kind of sets a genetic foundation. And if you've got that, you could develop narcolepsy at some point during your life. About 10 plus years ago, something horrible happened in Northern Europe. Around the world, there was this flu going around that was called the H1N1 flu. And it was pretty bad flu. And there was a lot of people dying from it. And governments around the world were really eager to get their populations vaccinated. And so they made a big push, and different brands of vaccines were developed in different countries. And in Northern Europe, there was a vaccine that went by the brand name of Pandemrix that was used. And it was a very effective vaccine. It stirred up a really strong immune response against this H1N1 flu. But a couple months after it was given, doctors started seeing lots of kids and young adults developing narcolepsy. And in 2002, 2003, 2004, there's hardly even one, there's less than one kid per 100,000 kids developing narcolepsy per year. But then in the winter of 2009, 2010, when this vaccine was used, that number shot up to over three and a half kids per 100,000. In the 11 to 16-year-old group in red, there was an even more obvious spike where they went from about one kid per 100,000 getting narcolepsy to now it was 8 or 9. And you can see the same thing is true for 17 to 19-year-olds. And it's not so obvious for the older people, that over 20 years old, that there wasn't such an obvious spike. In subsequent research, it does look like young adults might have also had a small increase in new cases of narcolepsy after receiving this vaccination. Subsequent research showed that the number of cases went back down to its background levels in the subsequent years. And so overall, what happened was that if you got this vaccine, this particular brand of vaccine, it produced about an 8 to 12-fold increase in new cases of narcolepsy, but it was mainly in children. And these vaccines had something mixed into it called an adjuvant that stirs up a strong immune response. And in this case, it was ASO3, which isn't used in vaccines anymore after this happened. And so all these kids who got narcolepsy after getting this vaccine turned out to be genetically vulnerable. They all carry this 0602 gene. And for the most part, they developed narcolepsy, NT1, that is, type 1, about 40 days after getting the vaccine. And so what this shows is something super important. I mean, the whole thing is terribly tragic, but it teaches us a lot about narcolepsy. It shows that first, you need to have this gene to develop narcolepsy, the 0602. Second, certain age groups are more vulnerable to develop narcolepsy. And in this case, it's children and teenagers. And that's when narcolepsy generally develops anyway. And then third, there's got to be some kind of immune stimulus that kicks the immune system in a way that can cause it to attack those orexin or hypocretin neurons in the brain. And so in the subsequent years, Dr. Mignot, some groups in Europe, Dr. Bassetti, collaborators in Switzerland, found specific immune cells that target the orexin or hypocretin neurons. And some of these immune cells cross-react with some of the things in this particular Pandemrix vaccine. So what we think is going on is that when kids received this vaccine, their immune system responded properly. It made immune cells that were targeting the proteins in the vaccine, and that's good because that's prepping it to fight the flu if they ever encountered it. But some of those molecules are probably rather similar to molecules found on the orexin neurons. And so those immune cells cross-reacted with the orexin neurons and killed them as well. And so it's this case of what we call molecular mimicry, where the immune system is getting confused and it says, oh, I'm attacking the flu, but it's actually attacking the orexin neurons as well. It's like a perfect storm. You're born with certain genes, you got to be a certain age, and there's got to be something that stirs up the immune system in a bad way. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is that there is no evidence that any other vaccines used in that season or in any other season can trigger narcolepsy. So, in the United States and Canada, where they use different brands of vaccine, there was no clear increase in narcolepsy cases. And in other years, there's been no clear increase in relationship to the flu vaccine. So as a general rule, I'm encouraging people with narcolepsy and, if they're wondering about what to do with their kids, I'm just saying get the regular vaccinations, because this was a really, really isolated problem specific to this brand, Pandemrix. And I know of no evidence that any of the other routine vaccinations or the yearly flu vaccinations, or for that matter, any of the new COVID vaccinations are capable of triggering narcolepsy. Now, of course, anything's possible, but at least thus far, there's really no clear evidence to raise those concerns.
Dr. Scammell, what would be some of the other environmental factors that could trigger? I have the DBQ0602 marker, as you helped. Obviously, I think that was one of the first things you did was look at that. But then I don't personally know my environmental factors. What other things are possible?
Well, there's been some research suggesting that just very mundane things like strep infections might actually be a trigger. And so, for instance, if you look at the levels of antibodies against strep, they tend to be higher in people in the year or so after they develop narcolepsy, suggesting that they might have had a strep infection that preceded the onset of narcolepsy. So we're talking here about spontaneous people who just spontaneously develop it, nothing to do with vaccinations. But if you just take a bunch of kids with new narcolepsy, sometimes there's evidence that, hey, they had strep recently. And of course you say, well, kids are always getting strep, but you can compare them to age-matched kids and the levels of antibodies are still higher. Other than that, we don't have any other evidence for specific triggers. However, there is kind of a seasonality to onset. So in China, where there's lots of people and pretty good tracking of cases, at least in the big cities, it does seem that the onset of narcolepsy is more common in sort of the period from March through June, suggesting that maybe if there's this lag of a month or two, maybe some winter infection was a triggering event. The thing that's kind of frustrating about that is who knows what the trigger is, right? There's so many just winter infections that are normally floating around. But on the other hand, you could sort of say, well, you know what? There's really no way to avoid these things. And so, at least at the moment, lacking any specific known triggers, I don't encourage people to stress about this too much. It's just, you got to live your life and not worry about the triggering things.
Yeah. Though I think people always try to it's come probably human nature to try to look back and be like, what could have been, even if there's nothing to do about it necessarily.
Yeah. So Julie, when you developed narcolepsy, do you think can you identify anything that might have preceded it?
One of the only times when I think it got worse pretty quickly, I did have 2 severely decayed teeth and I had to have root canals on them. And I think I don't know if I ever asked you if that could have been an infection that could have somehow caused. What do you think about that?
Well, I think in that case, yeah, your immune system is fighting off the inflammation around those teeth, right? And so your immune system was kicked into gear for some reason. And maybe, do you think it worsened your narcolepsy or do you think it preceded it?
I think my sleepiness started when I was in college in an abnormal way. And this would have been my junior year, between my junior and my senior year of college. And it's one time when I just really remember it feeling a little bit worse.
Yeah. You raise an interesting question of, after the first few months of symptoms, does narcolepsy get worse? Right. If somebody has moderate sleepiness a year after the narcolepsy develops, is it possible that they might get worse over time? And we don't actually have a whole lot of evidence for this. There is a smattering of research suggesting that at least in a small number of people, orexin levels in spinal fluid can actually fall over the course of months or years after the onset of narcolepsy. But in your case, that you raised the question of might an additional immune activation actually kill off a few more of those neurons? And I suppose it's possible, but it's not something that we know anything about right now, and it's not something one can plan on or avoid. But in general, my usual feeling is that most people sort of develop, plateau in their narcolepsy symptoms within a few months or that first year.
Okay, that's interesting because I always thought my sleepiness probably started around 18, but then my cataplexy and hypnagogic hallucinations were when I was 21, very distinctly. But I don't think the sleepiness I experienced at 18 or 19 was was average, so, but I don't know.
Some of this stuff may also be the brain adjusting to the loss of the orexin neurons too, that the brain is trying to compensate and then weird stuff happens. And so, for instance, we are working with some mice right now that we developed where we can acutely kill off the orexin neurons. And within 1 week, the mice are super sleepy. They don't get any worse after that first week, but they don't really develop full-blown cataplexy until 6 weeks later.
Oh, wow.
And so there's something weird that happens. The orexin neurons are dead and gone, but then the cataplexy lags way behind.
Wow, that's really interesting.
So yeah, it may be that some of the symptoms that we see are not directly a consequence of orexin neuron loss or orexin peptide loss, but rather they're a response to how the brain is trying to adjust. More on that later.
Yeah. And so I think, but you raise another really important thing, which is kind of a question I hear a lot from people. Well, if you've had a type 2 narcolepsy diagnosis for 10 years, could you all at once spontaneously develop cataplexy at that point?
It does happen occasionally. It's unusual. If you follow those people, and Dr. Mignot has a nice paper on this, a pretty good number of them, like maybe 25% of those people who start off without cataplexy, but have low orexin levels, about 25% of those people will develop cataplexy eventually, but it can take years. And so it's possible that, again, maybe there's some ongoing loss of orexin neurons, or maybe it's just the brain adjusting to that situation. But yes, type 2 narcolepsy occasionally does evolve into type 1 narcolepsy.
Of course, there's also cases I hear of someone being asked like, oh, do you collapse over with emotion, or do loss of muscle tone? And someone will say, no, I don't do that. And not realizing until they hear more from other people living with narcolepsy and cataplexy, like, oh, so it could be that I just lose my smile, when I laugh, or just a little bit of my jaw or my eyes fluttering. So it's really, I'm sure that for this, they really draw it out who really has cataplexy or not. But it is interesting how it's still hard for people to even understand sometimes when they're being asked about it.
And this is where working with a doctor who knows narcolepsy well can be very helpful, so that they're asking the right questions. Because if you only ask, do you fall down when you laugh, you're going to miss a lot of cataplexy. Sure, that happens a bunch, but I think for every episode of full-blown fall down cataplexy, many people have 10 times as many partial episodes where, as you say, their face goes slack, the eyelids close, their head bobs forwards, their speech gets slurred, stuff like that. This is a little more detailed than most people might care for, but I'll try to get through it quickly.
No, you have the science nerds here. It's good. It's good.
Okay. Is some little creepy crawlies. We can call them pathogens. All right. So those are bacteria and viruses. Your body's always fighting these every day. You're fighting off various invaders like this. And there's these cells called antigen presenting cells, or APC here, which are basically these little things that gobble up these pathogens, and they chop them up into little bits and kill the bacteria and the viruses. But that's not enough to have a good immune response. And so what they do is they take those little snippets of broken up bacterial proteins and they send them to the outside of their cell, where they're presented by these, it's called MHC class 2 cells. That's actually the HLA molecule that we talked about before, the 0602. They take those little chunks of pathogens, the little pieces are called peptides, and they stick them on their outside, bound to this MHC class 2 molecule, and they show them to what are called T cells, these CD4 cells. And the CD4 cells then make chemicals that can help kill bacteria called cytokines, and this whole network together can help kill off infections. So the bacteria get chopped up, little bits of them get shown to the T cells get activated, they release cytokines, it kills the bacteria. That's the normal situation. This is what we think might be going on in narcolepsy, which is that some of these T cells then cross into the brain across this thing called BBB, blood-brain barrier. And it turns out that some of those T cells are cross-reacting with something expressed on the orexin neurons. And so these cells, even though think that they're killing off a virus or a bacteria, they actually are targeting the orexin neurons and they kill those cells too. So it's sort of a question of accidental molecular mimicry, where the molecules look similar, but they're really on your native orexin neurons.
What are like the next steps of figuring out the process? Like, what are the biggest unknowns?
Yeah, well, one of the things is, it's all fine to say that there's T cells that cross-react with these orexin neurons, but are they the killers? That's one thing. We need to find sort of the smoking gun here, because if it really is those T cells, then maybe we can do something to influence the activity of T cells. Like, for instance, there's drugs that can prevent the movement of T cells across the blood-brain barrier. It keeps the T cells outside the brain and they don't get into the brain. And so if you were to catch somebody early enough when they're just beginning to develop narcolepsy, maybe you could give one of these drugs to help prevent the T cells from getting in and killing more orexin neurons.
Is there any research around trying to find other ways to measure hypocretin? Because it sounds, I mean, the spinal tap is pretty invasive. And so I remember when you diagnosed me, you said, well, you know, there's probably not likely many hypocretin or orexin left, and it's not really worth it. There was no big question for me. But do you think that that's would that be helpful if we could better
Um,
measure that
in
easily?
people who have such clear narcolepsy as you do, the measuring orexin in spinal fluid isn't really necessary because the other evidence is so strong. I think it's more useful in people where I'm kind of wondering, it's like, is this really cataplexy? Something's a little odd about this story, or this is weird. This person doesn't have the gene that we would expect them to. That kind of stuff where the pieces don't line up in the normal way. That's when I think it's very nice. And actually, probably the most common circumstance is people with narcolepsy have a higher prevalence of depression than the general population. So it's not unusual for somebody to come into clinic on antidepressants, and maybe their depression is substantial enough they can't stop those medicines. And yet antidepressants mess up the multiple sleep latency test. And so we can't really do a proper multiple sleep latency test when somebody's taking antidepressants. And so if somebody's depression is fragile enough that we don't want to stop those medicines, a spinal tap's a very short path towards getting a clear diagnosis of type 1 narcolepsy. People would love to have a blood test. The thing that's tough is that while a teeny amount of orexin may leak out of the brain into the bloodstream, it probably gets chopped up pretty fast. And there's a few papers that claim to have measured orexin in blood, but I actually think they have a lot of technical problems, and I'm not convinced that this is really working. Birgitte Kornum, a researcher in Denmark, has a fairly recent paper on this, where I think she's getting some measurements, but you have to do it in a very particular way. And most importantly, what they're measuring when they measure a teeny bit of orexin in blood, it's not any different in people with narcolepsy or healthy individuals. And so there may be a teeny amount of orexin in the blood, but it doesn't reflect the deficiency of orexin in the brain. So I'm not holding my breath for a blood test anytime soon.
Okay, all right.
No, I wish,
Yeah.
and maybe there'll be some other sort of more indirect markers of it, but I think a blood test is not imminent. So we've talked about how narcolepsy is caused by a loss of the orexin neurons. So how does that then result in sleepiness? And so here's a human brain. This is kind of cut right down the middle. And so up top, you can see the cortex. At the bottom, you can see the brainstem. And in the middle is where the orexin neurons are, the hypothalamus, and that's where the orexin neurons live. Normally, the orexin neurons send strong connections to lots of brain regions that help wake you up. And these make neurotransmitters that you might have heard of before, like acetylcholine, histamine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. And these are found all up and down the brainstem and hypothalamus. And so under normal circumstances, the orexin neurons help turn on these other types of neurons, which then help keep you awake. But what we think is going on is that in the absence of orexin, the activity of those target regions is just inconsistent. And so they're not releasing histamine and dopamine and serotonin like they should. And what that results in is sleepiness, where people can easily lapse into episodes of sleep. And also, if you don't have enough, for instance, norepinephrine and serotonin, your REM sleep is going to get kind of weird too. So the way we're thinking about this now, and it hasn't been proven yet, is that it may be that in normal circumstances, norepinephrine, serotonin, et cetera, stay at nice high levels while you're awake through the day. But if you don't have orexin, those systems are kind of flickering a little bit, and they're not releasing the neurotransmitters as consistently or to the same extent as normal. And so that could be the cause of the sleepiness.
We had a guest when we were talking about napping, I guess. He's a pediatric sleep doctor who also has narcolepsy. He talked about how, we often think of like narcolepsy as like kind of what you're saying, that it's a loss of wakefulness as opposed to somehow the sleep drive. It was talking about the wake versus sleep drivers, and how it's really the loss of the wake drivers as opposed to the sleep drivers somehow getting stronger, right?
Great. I think that's a super important perspective on this. And that I think that fundamentally the sleepiness of narcolepsy is about poor maintenance of wakefulness. That normal consistent alertness that most people have just doesn't really work so great in narcolepsy. And so it's a problem of keeping the normal systems that help keep you alert. They're just not working right. It's kind of like a city that doesn't have enough electricity, and you have these brownouts where you're just not powering things adequately. And so you have these lapses into sleep. In contrast, my intuition, and there's not a lot of evidence for this, is that idiopathic hypersomnia is kind of the opposite problem. It's not a problem of staying awake, it's a problem of waking up. And so that's why a lot of idiopathic hypersomnia people have a heck of a time waking in the morning, and they can sleep for 12 hours at night. But once they're awake, they actually can generally stay awake better through the day than somebody with narcolepsy. They're not lapsing into sleep quite as frequently as someone with narcolepsy. But yes, I think the phrase that we use all the time is poor maintenance of wakefulness in narcolepsy.
I like that, because I think it's also important to remember like that it's not always falling asleep. Like that's what a big thing I always talk about is that people think, oh, are you falling asleep right now? And I think it's partly from, movies. But to realize how invisible sleepiness can be is that your eyes can be open, but you could be on another planet or not remembering what's happening and all the cognitive.
And so just as an example, maybe I'm just making this up, but maybe that's your norepinephrine neurons lapsing, but some of the other systems are still kind of going, right? And so you're literally not running on all cylinders, if that makes sense, right? It's enough. It's like in a car, not that in an old car, if one spark plug fails, the engine actually can still run even with 3 cylinders firing, right? It's not running well, but it's still running. And so I think you could imagine a similar scenario where there may be sort of lapses in one or the other of these neurochemical systems. Not enough to make you fall asleep, but certainly enough to impair cognition.
That's interesting. I like that. I know there are probably a lot of other questions. I was just curious. I really do feel like orexin, we knew about the loss of hypocretin orexin 20 years ago now, over 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed for a while that there was no interest in, or very little interest in developing treatments. And, but I was wondering if you think that possibly as we learn more about hypocretin and that there could be other, or orexin, the system has to do with more than just narcolepsy too, right? And if any of that research is of interest, not for necessarily for narcolepsy, but what else is orexin being looked at for?
Right. So, boy, that's a big question. So I think you might know that there's now several pharmaceutical companies that are interested in designing drugs that mimic the effects of orexins. And the hope is that they will really improve alertness and help suppress cataplexy in people with type 1 narcolepsy. But your question's a good one in that, well, everybody's got an orexin system. And so what's it doing most of the time? And it's actually kind of surprising. We don't know a heck of a lot about that. You could look at the other symptoms that sometimes show up, like, there's more obesity, mood can be down in narcolepsy. There's other stuff that doesn't get as much attention as sort of the major sleep symptoms. And who knows, it's possible that some of these drugs that influence the orexin system might be helpful for other problems too. Like maybe they will help with mood, maybe they will help with weight loss, getting back to a normal weight, that kind of thing.
I feel like there's also research in drug abuse.
Yes. And this gets even more complicated. So the current drugs that are being developed so there's 2 receptors in the brain for the orexins. They're called OX1 and OX2. And OX2 is the one that seems to be most important for promoting wakefulness and regulating REM sleep. OX1 maybe has more to do with some of the potential drug abuse pathways. We call them reward pathways in the brain. And if you activate these, animals find it rewarding. If you give an animal a drug that can be abused, like opiates or amphetamines, it activates these reward pathways. And so it's possible that a drug that activates the orexin 1 receptor could actually be a little bit of trouble in the sense that it might have some addictive potential. And the hope is that a drug that targets the orexin 2 receptor may be less likely to do so. But again, this is really early days. And the truth is orexin 1 and orexin 2 receptors are expressed in lots of different brain regions, and there's a lot of overlap. And so I think, at least for research purposes, someday it would be really nice to have drugs that target each of these very selectively.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting because, when people talk about rare disease drugs, and I wonder if orexin, if it wasn't for narcolepsy, would orexin have been discovered? Maybe at some point.
Well, orexins were discovered before the connection to narcolepsy was even known. But I think the research on this whole system has certainly been accelerated by the strong disease connection. It's much easier to get research funding from the government if you can say, we're doing this to try to help people with narcolepsy.
Okay. All right.
So we've got the orexin neurons, and normally they would be connecting to some of these dopamine neurons in the brainstem. And dopamine is a really important system in these reward pathways. So there's quite a lot of research now suggesting that orexin activation of dopamine neurons enhances rewarding behaviors. And actually, the strongest evidence comes from animal research. When they give a drug that blocks the orexin 1 receptor, mice are much less likely to abuse amphetamines, cocaine, opiates, and things like that. And so it seems that an orexin blocker might actually help in drug addiction. And now there's the beginnings of some clinical research along those lines. So if orexins normally enhance activity in these reward pathways, then what happens in somebody with narcolepsy where there's less orexin? Well, maybe those reward pathways are not as active as they should be. And maybe the consequence of that is that things that should normally make you feel good and be rewarding just don't give you quite that same thrill. And maybe that results in some depression. That's just speculation on my part, but in a very sort of broad sense, maybe a loss of orexin excitation of the dopamine system can depress mood.
I always wonder about these, and I've probably mentioned this to you before, Dr. Skimmel, about whether when we are asking people on the clinical side, if they have a depression diagnosis along with narcolepsy, whether it's ever clarified that that could have possibly been a misdiagnosis on a way to a narcolepsy diagnosis, and how much that's parsed out, just out of curiosity, because it seems that depression is one of those, when we say it's 8 to 15 years for average and many people are never diagnosed, it's one of the things that was suggested to me that could be happening before I found that I had narcolepsy. So is that ever parsed out?
Well, I think that this is yet another reason why there's such a delay in diagnosis, why it can take a long time, because depression is really common, right? I mean, there's way more people with depression than there are with narcolepsy. And so if you go to a primary care doctor or a psychiatrist and you say, oh, I'm just so tired, I can hardly get things done, I'm not doing well in my classes, they're going to think depression first because that's common. And that's no fault of theirs. And the unfortunate thing is many docs just aren't familiar with narcolepsy. And so they don't ask the next questions, right? And so somebody with depression would say, oh, I just can't get out of bed in the morning. I'm not getting anything done. And maybe in the afternoon, I get a little bit done. But somebody with narcolepsy would say, oh, I actually feel pretty alert in the morning. And I get my best work done then. But then at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I just crash and burn and have to take a nap, right? It's a very different feel, but it depends on how you probe into the person's symptoms. And so I haven't seen any sort of research on this, but I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if in people who truly have narcolepsy, I wouldn't be surprised if depression is sort of one of the wrong diagnoses that gets tossed around prior.
Thank you. That's as always my curiosity, because yeah, I don't know. And when people do genetic testing and they send off like their spit or something, would something like that ever come up?
If you just did like 23andMe or something like this,
Yeah.
I don't know if it shows up on that. We send it as a special lab test. And my guess is that 23andMe and that kind of sort of non-specific genetic testing doesn't drill in with that level of detail. But it's a lab test that can be done pretty much anywhere. So the gene, again, is called HLA-DQB1 star, like an asterisk, 0602. Cataplexy is super interesting, right? I mean, how is it that laughing would actually make you fall to the ground? It's literally the just nuttiest thing imaginable. And so we're starting to put together the pathways. And this is how we think it goes, is that first off, you got to perceive that something's actually funny or surprising or novel or whatever it is that triggers your cataplexy. And so that's done up in the cortex. And we think that the medial prefrontal cortex is important. Normally, the medial prefrontal cortex would excite neurons in the amygdala. The amygdala is an emotion regulating area. And they also excite the orexin neurons. Well, the amygdala sends inhibitory projections to this area in the brainstem. This brainstem region normally helps suppress REM sleep. And so the amygdala reduces activity in that area, and the orexin neurons would normally increase activity. So they kind of balance out. But if the orexin neurons are gone, then the amygdala is unopposed. And what we think happens is that those positive emotions are routed through the amygdala. That then turns off this area that is supposed to be putting the brakes on REM sleep, but it's not now because the amygdala is turning it off. And so that allows for increased activity in brain regions further down that promote REM sleep. And when we say REM sleep, we're talking about the paralysis of REM sleep, really. And ultimately, that inhibits the neurons that control your muscles, the motor neurons. So there's a lot of steps in this. But the idea is that something that you perceive as funny or novel triggers emotional pathways. Those emotional pathways mess up the REM sleep regulating pathways in the brainstem. And then before you know it, the motor neurons are inhibited and you get weak.
And so is this some of what you're working on?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of this stuff in mice. We've been focusing on the amygdala for the last several years now. And we're trying to figure out specific types of neurons in the amygdala. And because if we could figure out like, oh, it's this very special type of cell, then maybe we can, help develop drugs that can help influence the activity of those cells without doing a whole lot of other stuff, and target cataplexy more specifically than some of the current drugs.
Also, just wanted to thank everyone for your advocacy, because some of what Dr. Scammell works on is funded through federal grants, right? And so we're really, really grateful to all the advocates that are working so hard on making sure that sleep disorders research gets funded through NIH. And so, it's not ever an exact pathway that one person took action and it led to something like Dr. Scammell getting research funding, but it's an important part of the process. So it's cool that we're all here together and get to, see some of your work and try to understand it. It's tough for me. This stuff is a little bit tough for me to quite understand, but yeah. So just thanks for everyone for taking part in that process as well. Thank you, Dr. Scammell, so much for taking this time today to be with us. Thank you, everybody.
The Project Sleep podcast is produced by Carver Sound Productions. For more information on podcast production services, visit carversoundproductions.com.